this is a spoiler.
You can't
You
listen to
know,
this and not have spoilers.
This is huge, right? I mean, this is
It's
like
kinda
inspires all horror.
It's kind of huge, and he's really the dawn of it all. He was post Poe, maybe at the same around the same time. He adored Poe, but he's different. He really is at the dawn of creating this world of sci-fi horror, and in a really kind of really horrible way, in a good way. Anyway, I'm going to first start the end of it. There's this yacht, the Emma, that was manned by Johansson and colleagues, and they were attacked by this yacht, the Alert, which was manned by, quote, a queer and evil-looking crew. The Emma boarded the Alert and beat them down. Then they manned the captured Alert, finding themselves on this island. Remember, this is the end. The island is actually on top of Cthulhu's temple, which is under the ocean. So what ended up happening in the course of this crash and sort of climbing onto this weird island that apparently defies structure and balance and geometry, as far as we know, what happens is they end up going through this weird little portal and going into it. And again, it's hard to describe because that's kind of the way Lovecraft is. I'm sure you noticed in the writing, the way he writes and describes everything is kind of weird. It's not just a question or function of the time of writing in the beginning of the 20th century, but it's kind of the way he is. It's kind of odd. For instance, in describing what they see when they go through this portal on this island that they crashed into, it says the very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from the sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leeringly in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity. This is the kind of odd, wild, fascinating, confusing, distorted language that is throughout this story that not only reflects, I think, the time of writing, but also reflects him. And he was a weird dude. Sorry to all you Lovecraft fans, but he was wild and strange. And another thing is he was poor all his life. He never ate. He ate very little. He was fascinated with New England and lived in New England. He lived in New York for a while. And in New York, this whole raging racism of his mushroomed because New York obviously was a place of a lot of immigrants at that time and still is. Anyway, back to the ending of the story, where in the portal they discover, and I'm going to quote from the book, the odor rising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty, slopping sound down there, the sound that he hears, right, when they've gone through this portal. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. And this is the creature Cthulhu, and he's emerged. And what Johansson and these people do after they run back to the yacht, the Alert, is that they try to escape, but then they turn around and end up going through Cthulhu, or at him, it. And then it ends up spewing all of this green ooze all over the place, a cloud of stuff all over him. And then somehow the Alert escapes again, and the creature descends, recreates itself. Anyway, the reason I summarize the ending first is that it's the only time in the story when humans confront Cthulhu in real time. So just so that we know the overall structure, the story is told by the great-nephew, this goes back to the beginning, whose grandfather, Professor Angel, an archaeologist, has died and left him his papers. And he discovered some very strange coincidences, as well as this frightening bas-relief of a monster. Anyway, what the nephew finds is a weird cult rite going on in New Orleans, a weird fevered experience by this architect, Will Cox, who had dreams of this Cyclopean temple, and those weird words, Cthulhu, Tagan, can't really pronounce it, and other worldwide occurrences. Now, the date, this is another weird fact that I hear, is the date on which, remember Will Cox, the architect, had this weird febrile, collapsed in these weird dreams and everything. Apparently the date on which he had that fever, which I think might have been March 23rd. And again, the dates are kind of important, but when he had this fever, apparently that day, Lovecraft was referencing occurrences that actually happened in the real world. And I tried to Google this and I haven't found it yet. But apparently on that particular date, some weird shit happened across the world. There was like an increase in suicides worldwide. There was an increase in some weird activity, occult activity worldwide. So generally, when you look at the big picture, it's this nephew who's looking at his great uncle's papers of this weird occurrence of this creature, Cthulhu. And then he's reading through or going through these various different times when people were searching or reacting to this creature or effect or something that was occurring in the world. Now, there's one thing I wanted to say that really jumped out at me about Wilcox. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal. Hence, the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. Bryden, who was Johansson's colleague on the ship that crashed, pushed at the stone in several places. This is when they were on the island, without result. Then Donovan, another colleague, felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding. That is, one would call it climbing if the thing was not, after all, horizontal, and the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion, it moved anomalously in a diagonal way so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed upset. Again, I think that Lovecraft didn't have the language that he needed, or he was struggling with the language that he needed to describe this evil creature, this evil fact, this evil event in the world that has never really kind of been discussed before. And in a way, that's why he's considered the grandfather of all great horror, or at dawn of this, because he didn't have the language yet. And that's why he's talking about geometry. I mean, geometry. He's trying to describe this evil event that affected the world and the humans in a way that he couldn't describe. Anyway, that's why I found that fascinating that he brings up the issue of geometry. That's my onward.
Thank you.
I think I need a drink.
Yeah. I thought a lot about the geometry also, and I went and I started looking around because it seemed to me like this was basically fear. I don't know. Sometimes I think that it always comes back to fear for me. But I looked at what was going on scientifically at the time to see if this were just a reaction to science. I mean, there's so many parallels. I mean, Frankenstein was written 100 years earlier than this.
Right.
But still there are parallels. I hope no one ever finds out about this kind of thing. Like, don't let on the secret.
The voyage is
Stokes monkey trials had just happened. 1925, and he published this in 1926. So, science was definitely taking over for God in many ways. And I think that has a lot to do with it. There were also huge advances going on in quantum theory. There were really big advances taking place. And all of this mystery, there was mystery being, opened up in certain areas, but the mysteries of the universe were being solved. So mankind and the mysteries of God and stuff like that were being minimized. And I think that's where the fear comes in. We're not important in the universe anymore.
So it's less a horror about the supernatural or that kind of the supernatural than it is about just like insignificance. And
if that's the case, if it's talking to the unspeakable, then there's a way that it's almost about science, or what science is about too. It's grasping at like the unknown versus the known, and being in horror of the deep unknown. The old ones that this is. About,
the old ones,
they existed before humanity, or before there was life on Earth as we know it, and they are still there. I think that at the very beginning that he said a very interesting thing, which was that there was a great survival. This is a quote from Algernon Blackwood. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. And then to go, forward a little bit more with, this idea of like needing a language, I think it's interesting that the inspector in New Orleans is hitting upon this notion about the cult that they are worshiping tombs, and it's the tombs of these old ones that are communicating via thought, that their language is just something that's transmitting and people are picking up on. But on my page 12 of this, they talk about the cult and the prisoners and said that it always existed, and someday Cthulhu, would call when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. It's important to know this isn't just a new cult, right? This isn't, this has always been the cult.
It's always been there.
They are operating in the farthest remotes, and uncontacted tribes or unknown religions. There's not a lot of evidence for it. It's just something that's found out there as objects of worship. And in a way, whenever you have a cult worshiping something that's intangible, you cross that border again into that unknown, which seems to be what all this is about. Though it's interesting because it gives you all of that metaphysical horror, I suppose, in a manifest horror way. I mean, you actually do see this giant beast, and they drive through it. There actually are relics, that look like octopus heads on, crab demons.
Those idols.
I think it's interesting that the comment about science, and of course science is like an ordering enterprise of making sense of the world, but the whole like horror of the whole cult, the whole Cthulhu thing was like this primal energy that predated this order that we have in the world. I like compared it to where we talked about like Rousseau's man and Frankenstein as far as being a noble beast and becoming savage through civilization. I feel like this took the opposite approach where like the primal energy of mankind was this horrible, horrible, senseless thing, and that in artists uncovering the truth about, the deep truth about humanity is they're reaching in and seeing that like terrible primal energy again. I mean, in the story, they explicitly mention that like the working class didn't have these terrible dreams of Cthulhu. Scientists kind of did, but not really. But it was really the artists that were deeply affected by these horrible nightmares. So in a way, maybe Lovecraft is making a comment as far as art uncovering the nature of mankind, and it's horrible.
I wanted to link this in here. This is still about New Orleans, but they say that them remained intact from making any moves. They just lied awake in the dark and thinking for millions of years. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, for their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When after infinities of chaos the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams. For only thus could their language reach the fleshy minds of mammals. And that idea that there's being something radiated or picked up on, I think hints back to that hypernatural or metanatural or perceived natural, what it's like, maybe a fear-based response to the world. But it's easy.
Or the radio. The signals are there, right? You just have to tune in.
Yeah, well, and then I think about this like with the radio, with what you were talking about, the Lovecraft as well, that, there was that War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles, but I imagine that any radio broadcast would pull from that kind of era where you're recounting something and you slowly build to a reveal. And it's real the whole time. I mean, it's an inspector and documents, and just like in Frankenstein and the Phantom of the Opera, it's couched in found material. This is the truth. This is the story of a voyage. And you're not supposed to have seen it. If these documents get out, I think that's the last line. I hope no eyes see this.
Right. Or you will suffer because of that.
And also he's, how long will I make it? I like that. I like that little trope,
How long will I make it?
Well, yeah, now that I'm actually, writing this down, I've sealed my fate.
There is a line here. Remember Castro? Then whispered Castro, whose first men formed the cult around small idols, which the great ones showed them. Idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. The cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. the time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild, and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. And all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom.
That was my major go-to. I mean, because they're talking about also maintaining something. There's a way in which the people are tending these old ones, and it's not going to be but through them that they become manifest again. Whether or not it's a cult that's going to be maintaining them, or they're going to be passing this figure around, or something a little bit more eerie, which I think is played out at the very end with Cthulhu. It looks like he was imprisoned. That maybe the old ones also had, or a temple of Cthulhu. It seems like he was put away, and by going out and searching for it, they had finally done it and came up with it. By sheer pursuit, they unleashed the beast.
I mean, it might be that the old gods replaced them. There's a mention of Tartarus fairly close to the end. I don't know if this is what you actually read before, Laura. There is a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on a comet tail, and of hysterical plunges from the pit of the moon and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened by a cachinnating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green, bat-winged, mocking imps of Tartarus. When I read that, I thought, the very primal gods had been replaced by the gods of Tartarus, replaced by the Greeks.
Right.
And then those replaced by Judeo-Christian or whatever, Hindu or whatever, and, Hindu before. But whatever whichever way you wanted to take it, if we went back to our most primal, here we are, we've walked so far away from it, we actually have quantum physics. There are no gods. But when we kill ourselves with with the science, when we drive ourselves completely mad from all of the proof that we are actually not special in the universe, then we will go back to hanging with Cthulhu.
Does this remind anyone of the biblical story of Moses and the golden calf?
Oh.
They had a specific passage, I can't quite find it, about when they found the worshippers and they were worshipping an 8-foot tall statue with fire around and dancing around in a circle. And it just reminded me of the story of Moses when he went to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. He was gone for 40 days and 40 nights, and the Israelites got restless, so they got a bunch of gold together, made a golden calf, and started worshipping it. And of course, Moses comes back and is angry and throws his tablets down and yells at people and starts, getting people to kill false believers. But I think it's analogous to, you just remove this law and order for just the slightest amount of time, and humans naturally go back to this, ferocious reveling that seems to be innate in them.
Yeah, mob mentality happens all the time still, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's paralleled in the story also with, the racism where, every single group that's a part of this Cthulhu worship is some sort of minority described in the worst kinds of ways.
He really was a snob.
It seemed even worse than that. I mean, he was like Cesario was pointing out, it wasn't veiled racist asides. It was just blatant, flat out snarling attacks on these groups of people that's just evil and just loathsome and mischievous and monstrous and wow.
But interestingly, all of them, to me, or at least the way that I read it was, they were always people who lived closer to the earth, pre-literate, more natural. So I'm not saying that he wasn't racist. He pretty obviously was. But I was interested that, it's always this kind of down there in the mess of real life, of actual tactile experience. These people who live closer to the earth are, they're dragging us all down.
You got that from his father, just so you know. I heard the raging racism.
My favorite slur that he writes is, and whilst high up on West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him in its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness.
Degenerate Eskimos.
What does that
Sounds like
mean?
a party, man.
I also heard that, this story was first published in that magazine or compilation called Weird Tales. And I heard that Lovecraft hated the editor because the editor kept fixing his spelling and changing it from the British spelling to American spelling. And it just infuriated Lovecraft.
He'd hate
So,
me.
Yeah. So, he had that stance that he was of a certain ilk, a certain kind.
But he was from Rhode Island, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the Victorian flourishes in this
Yeah.
story are truly, who else? He's basically going to say right here that, like, I wish I'd never seen this piece of paper. But the way he says it is, if heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain piece of shelf paper.
I know.
The definition of purple prose, right?
Yeah, well, again, and also, the time, but also him. It's the way he was, a highfalutin kind of guy that he was.
It sounds older than it is. This is when I heard of Lovecraft, I thought he was in the early 1800s, but this is what Hemingway was writing.
Yeah,
Right.
I know. It does sound older than it is. And I think, again, that's partly because of him, who he was. He was very affected.
Yeah, when I think of him, I think of someone who has a horror of dirt, a horror of mess.
Compulsive hand washer.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this section here that I remember, and I highlighted it because it maybe kind of was a summary of the whole story, and I don't know why he put it here. But it says here, March 1st or February 28th. Yeah, March 1st or February 28th, according to the international dateline, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin, the Alert had her noisome crew had darted eagerly forth as if imperiously summoned, and on the other side of the earth, poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank, cyclopean city, whilst a young sculptor had molded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulu. March 23rd, which is the date I kept kind of focusing on, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead. And on that date, the dreams of sensitive men, assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, whilst an architect had gone mad and a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of this storm of April 2nd, which is another date, the date on which all the dreams of the dank city ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of a strange fever? What of all this? And of those hints of old Castro about the sunken star-born old ones and their coming reign, their faithful cult, and their mastery of dreams? To me, it struck me as a bit of a summary of everything that had happened, and I think he was focusing on everything happening at one time or within that time frame of the late March into early April. Again, apparently, I've told that is an actual stuff was happening on those dates. Now, when you think about it philosophically, if we look at the whole big picture of what he's saying here, he's looking at this, trying to, I think, define who we are, who man is, in the context of the evil that exists within this world and always has.
Yeah, and it's star old.
But also those dates are around the beginning of spring, they're around Easter, they're around April Fool's Day, which
April
was
is the coolest month.
Right, but they're around this time of regeneration. If you look back, not back stars old, but certainly weather and the earth and rites, ancient humanity. This is the time of, it's all happening during the time of regeneration. Young man's fancy. So I found that interesting. I found it interesting that within the series of dates was most likely going to be Easter, the traditional New Year, and springtime.
Meanwhile, that's why I brought up that quote, April is the cruelest month. That's T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
Beginning of the Wasteland.
Right, because life is predicated on death.
Say the first line in the story, which I think, Cesare, you mentioned you really liked.
I think we all like that. The first paragraph, yeah.
Yeah, it's that I think is the most famous. But there was this quote someone mentioned to me. Oh, here it is. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die.
Unpack it for us.
Unpack it for you.
And do it in rhyme, please.
Okay. That is not dead. Okay, that is not dead, which can eternal lie. Okay, that's The Walking Dead. You know that show. Okay, that's The Walking That is not dead, which can eternal lie.
Jesus, everybody's favorite zombie?
Yeah.
Righty.
Yeah. All right.
That's why I said Easter, right?
Right. That's not dead, which
There's
can
resurrection.
eternal lie.
Yeah.
And with strange eons, even death may die. I mean, it's trying to control immortality. Control immortality through evil. I'm totally don't know what the fuck I'm saying.
No.
But I'm going for it.
Yeah, I just got a hint of the of that science fiction story that we wrote. That we read. Yeah.
we wrote
it.
I'm not even aware of this.
The sci-fi story that we read.
The last question.
Yeah.
Yes, the last question.
Yeah, and like with that one, I see with that passage, I wanted to bring that little. I think it's a quote within the story. It's not a character.
Right.
I think something like death, whatever that can lie forever can't die. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. That has a sweet ring to it. I mean, that's Cthulhu in his temple. He's not dead. He can just wait forever. You know what I mean? He'll talk to you through the dreams of. He'll just dream away aeons until it's time. And
yeah, except that his dreams are throwing people into fevers, and they're going mad, and they're people are dying under weird circumstances.
So what about nature? What about if this is just your primal nature calling you? What if the fact is that that it turns out that it's just nature? There is no, sure, maybe there's an earthquake, maybe things happen, whatever.
No,
I'm sure that if you took a look around the world every single day, you could find plenty of people who have gone mad.
Yeah.
So, but.
And maybe this. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say maybe the thing that will drive you mad is your own nature. Is that you are,
human.
Yeah, being of flesh.
Of flesh, yeah. That is not dead, which can eternally lie. So if you're not human of flesh, then you can eternally lie.
And again, I think it's important that, that opening line too, that something like the Cthulhu horror is just consciousness manifest. It's not really beyond that. I mean, it's the same way that those rituals are also powerful in and of themselves. They're, in a way, remanifesting the consciousness if you buy into the metaphysic of old ones being buried in tombs. But even if you don't take that, then you can just have the expression of the ritual is a manifestation of consciousness for all those people. I think it was interesting, your point, Cesare, about the golden calf, because, I mean, that's the New Orleans scene there with the Inspector Legrasse, I think.
Right.
I mean, could you imagine anything more weird than going out into the deep swamps, seeing dozens of people in a
They're
fire?
there now.
And yeah, they really are.
I'm sure they are. I'm sure if you know it.
Yeah, what I mean to say is that imagine
about Duck Dynasty?
And then, Duck Dynasty.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Nathan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then to have cops come in and bust it up.
And murder people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the cops actually, a couple of cops fainted and almost died, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before they were revived when they first went in there. But
so this consciousness being taken over by reason, that's all I wanted to point out there, was that you have something like just a manifest experience that has value judgments from the writer, but, I mean...
Consciousness taken over by reason. Isn't that Freud?
Perhaps. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
And actually, now that you mentioned that, the beginning there, because I wanted to say, Daniel, because you had asked me because I highlighted that the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Mm-hmm. And I happen to agree with that. But that's what that's why I said so Nietzsche when I quoted this in the forum, because that what I'm reading now is actually called The Uses and Disadvantages of History by Nietzsche, and his whole thing was it's such memory fucking destroys us. This memory is our prison, and that's what it's saying here in this first line. The most merciful thing in the world is our inability to correlate all its contents. I mean,
So
God, it is
does that mean that
merciful.
we can only be selectively conscious of certain types of like order, but we can't put it all together? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, we know instinctively that murder is wrong, but we can't connect that with the fact that, for instance, we're murdering people across the globe.
Well, yeah, and also connecting that to why.
Yeah.
Connecting it to, oh, wait a minute, it is our nature as human beings to murder and kill. It is our nature. So, being able to connect to that in a really significant way, and would destroy us. I mean, you would implode. Really, and that's why I think he's right when he says the most merciful thing in the world is our inability to correlate all those contents, and that's kind of what Nietzsche was saying too in this essay I'm reading, and was that and that's also what Freud was saying too. I hate to bring psychology into this, but
how can you not?
Yeah, how can you not really? But Nietzsche was saying, what we need to do is, in order to survive, in order for humanity to survive, is to be able to manage our memory, be able to manage our history, to be able to manage the past, and because we're obsessed with it, and as a result, it's destroying us, suffocating us. So Nietzsche was saying, and he was obviously prior to Freud, but he was saying we've got to be able to dispel and remember what we need to remember in order to survive, and forget what we need to forget. He was obviously, a precursor to the whole Freud's thing, the whole psychological stuff. But, it's this, it really jumped out at me when I read that.
Does he mean human history or personal history in that context?
All of it.
Yeah.
He goes into a whole discussion about the German people and how they really fucked themselves over. We can all come up with certain examples, obviously. But, yes, it's all of it.
One of you guys brought up the wasteland, and that was really what he was trying to do in that poem, right? Mm-hmm. Reorder history and, make some connections in this staggered kind of way between what, was going on now and, our total history. Right.
It's a real struggle, but this is really not our discussion right now. But it's a fascinating discussion, how we manage our history and our past.
I love that first paragraph, and it really reminds me of why I love fiction so much, and why a lot of principled philosophy really bothers me, because I don't think I like the partial truths and the things you can pull out of a work of fiction, and I always find that humanity is just not strong enough to be under some very principled philosophy or principled worldview, because like it mentions, it all falls apart if you just look wide enough.
Well, yeah,
we don't have. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Nathan.
Oh, I was just going to say, by example of characters in this story. Who went mad? Right?
Everybody.
But specifically, the engineer and the sculptor. The sensitive intellectuals.
Well, and who didn't die? The people who weren't killed by Cthulhu were the people who were just doing their jobs. Were the cops. They didn't get killed. Right. Everybody else, the people who were investigating it for, I don't know, maybe some form of scientific or some form of philosophical work, they all they were all killed. But the people who were just going about their day-to-day business, oh look, there are people in the swamp, kidnapping and murdering women and children. Got to go shut that down.
Take care of this.
Right.
Yeah, it's that difference between living in the world and trying to own the world, right?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I think there's an interesting twist to that, which is in the third chapter, where I wanted to save this for one of my favorite last lines, but I'll just read this here. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. What wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green sticky spawn of the stars, had awaked to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again and ravening for delight.
Right, and so it didn't matter. It didn't matter that, the people who actually were setting their sights on, who were trying to raise this thing, let's just say the priests in their churches of Cthulhu, they had no effect on Cthulhu. It was just plain old happenstance. It was the nature of life in the world. A bunch of sailors smacked into an island.
Right.
So could you just leave Cthulhu there? I mean, it seems like...
You have to.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it was put there in this kind of, Escher prison, to keep this thing at bay, and yet it is unearthed.
What the hell is under the ocean anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm asking you, like, today, now.
Well, I saw this movie Pacific Rim, and based on their theories.
Well, there's your Cthulhu.
Okay, we can talk about the Mariana Trench if you want, but we're not going to Pacific Rim. Sorry. Yeah,
No,
there are
okay.
transformers at the bottom of the ocean.
Transformer.
It's the mystery within, right? That's the thing about oceans. That's so calming.
Well, maybe
and so horrifying.
You guys kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but like, what, for my own personal benefit, like, what is Cthulhu here? Like, what is that? What is he the emblem of?
Not what he is physically, but what he represents.
Right. Yeah. I get the physical.
I mean, I just see disorder in this primal lust in humanity for a capacity for violence.
I second that.
Okay.
I think he's evil. I think he's evil in the world and in humanity, and that's what he is. It is. Hate to use the term E.
Yeah, well, in the story, right? I mean, just explicitly in the story, it's beyond good and evil.
Yeah.
That was that phrase.
Yeah, I always think of evil as a human invention. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't put Cthulhu as some
Just
sort
evil.
of... Yeah.
That's what I'm hanging up on, because I'm thinking about myth here, and I'm thinking about anthropocentrism and what is this exactly, like, whether it's a human invention, and if he's something that is old as stars, he proceeds and I guess will outlast humans maybe. What how do you attach meaning to that? Like, what signifies that if he's sort of outside the bounds of human experience and meaning?
Well, and that's why I think he's limited by his language is limited because of that, I guess.
Well, or what happens when you take mystery out of life, right? I think that's what science is. That's my feeling about the reaction to science, and the same way that I felt about Frankenstein, is that if you can't have the mystery of alchemy anymore, then you're going to have to create it somewhere else, right? If the world can actually be explained, and if we're not special because of it, if we're not, God's children, then what are we? And then what we are is very fearful, right? You just, if you don't have some sort of everlasting soul, if there's no paradise, if there's no big, no jackpot at the end of the rainbow, what are you really? And so I just kind of see this as, well, wait a minute, you're taking the mystery out of, I'm a monkey? I'm the descendant of a monkey. You've taken God, you've taken the mystery, and now I'm going to put it back in. I'm going to create I'm going to show you my primal being.
I think that is a lot of the drive.
That's great.
I think that a lot of people really do look to especially Lovecraft from a post-God perspective, they still want the awe, they want the demons, but they don't have the heaven and the hell anymore to situate that. And a lot of the, it's cosmic, and so it and it also the book goes against theosophists, which I imagine to mean God lovers, or no, that would be that's right.
No, the theosophists
God
were
promoters.
That was, but the Theosophical Society, wasn't that all about Madame Blavatsky? These were people who had seances and stuff like that. They were people who wanted mystery in the world.
I looked it up on Wikipedia, and the literal translation is God's wisdom, and it's trying to find like the origins of God, the universe, and humanity, and its interlinks.
But if you look on Wikipedia, there must be a link to like Madame Blavatsky. Or
sure, I know about this era. There was a rich vein in the early 19th century of people trying to get back to mysticism and seances and communications with the occult and unknown and crystal use and that kind of thing was taken hold of the American consciousness in a kind of swinging of the pendulum in another way.
Yeah. So what happens when the occult is no longer occluded, right? What happens when you can see clearly because of science what is, how things came about in the world?
That's why we always have and always will have poets.
Because God died, we needed poets.
To make the familiar strange again.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I still think that there's a function that's going on here. If, Cthulhu is this kind of, let's just say it's, it's an invention of this author and it's something real in the world of these characters. I still think that there's something that they're tapping into by holding a ritual, just in almost a similar way that, Cthulhu is an advancement of the God idea. It's that there really is this entity out there that can really, do you harm or make things or communicate messages to you and can, sway the world and is older than time.
But it didn't make our world, right? And it didn't make you. It's completely foreign. It is completely other. The rocks aren't the same as the idols are made from materials that aren't found on Earth. The slime, the Cyclopean geometry is completely other. So I found that really interesting.
Yeah, it's one of reminds me of, I don't want to hammer the biblical point too much, but a reading I like of the Old Testament is not that there is, God, the one true God, and everyone else is just wrong. It's sort of like a battle between the gods, and, Jehovah is the one that wants to be the strongest, but there was Moloch and there was the golden calf, and all these other gods were perceived as existent, but what the Old Testament was led to do is to promote Jehovah as the one true God, the God of rules, of law and order. But Cthulhu is another god out there, another god that just has a different value set, I suppose.
Yeah, and he better be a good god if I can't eat pork. Gee, better be giving me something good.
That's true.
Yeah, I like that, Cesare. I like that reading. Where does Thor come in?
Well, right, yeah, because he's a god that isn't necessarily, he's not going to put us at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
It's just this massive force out there that's, pervading life that we have to deal with, but yet it's not going to take us into, this ultimate consideration. We're just sort of in the, swaying in its wake,
Well, that's where I kind of get that, going back to that consciousness manifest thing. I mean, if Cthulhu is a manifestation of consciousness or phenomenality, then everybody who is part of the ritual is tapping into that by virtue of their conscious connection to it, whatever their feelings. If they're feeling chaotic in the orgy, that's tapping into it. So in a way, these are just, avatars for the human experience. And the Cthulhu avatar would be something horrible and escaping meaning. You can't look at it. Is it a demon? Is it a human? Is it a crab? Is it that's the point of this, kind of turn. And I wonder if there's not a lot more, more richly laid in there. I was just looking at some biblical research just recently, Wikipedia diving basically, but found out things like the beasts and the images of the beast were actually metaphors for the nations and kingdoms and powers of the world at the time, representing the known nations and etc. And so it wasn't really like a lion with griffin wings. It was more like, the Sahara and, I don't know, mountains, kingdoms. It was meant to depict something rather than create this new supernatural entity that had a life on its own alongside everything else. It wasn't about the big beast. It was about what's going on with your experience of the beast.
Spent a lot of time in church going over those metaphors.
And it's done wonders for all of us.
Yeah.
So Nathan, you're saying like the parts that he's composed of are metaphorical in that way? Like they tell...
It could be. It's beyond my reach now to consider what the message would be that's a codec for. What Cthulhu could be parsed out to represent as some message. It could be that, he's pulling from different kinds of religions, each one of those composites. I don't really know. I think that what's strongest to me is that it's preternatural, if I'm using that word right. It's what's the word I love so much? Atavistic,
it's really too bad we don't have Freud here to ask him what he thinks of a face full of tentacles.
Yeah.
What could that be?
Yeah.
I think to note as well that, remember, like, the people taking part in the rituals are these, he twists it in his racist way, but what he views as these primitive people, and that his job, it seems like the white man's burden here is to save civilization from this influence, right? That he sees it as a dangerous thing.
But the thing that they're saving them from is anybody finding out. Right? Anybody actually speaking the name of,
or perhaps finding it out first and getting ahead of the curve, so to speak, and put forward to science something that's been unknown.
In this email that I got from Seth, actually, I had sent him this email and said, has Nathan talked to you, blah, 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 and he said, I said, because we're going to be talking about Cthulhu, The Call of Cthulhu this Sunday by H.P. Lovecraft. And then Seth wrote back and said, I spoke with Nathan. He's going to talk to you, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, and yes, good luck with he who cannot be named. And that actually is a quote from a different story, as I've heard, of Lovecraft's, I think, Mountains of Madness or something else. But I don't know if the name Cthulhu can actually be stated. I'm not sure, but it goes to that idea of, these people who would, who looked at him or saw him, went mad in their dreams or in reality, like Johansson, the seaman who ended up dying. I don't know if that referred to Cthulhu specifically, but I think he was on that track, Lovecraft.
So I think I'm catching up now. So the name is something that you really can't say, and the creature is something you really can't look at. And he's coming out of this city that just can't even be figured out.
Right.
So everything is just beyond the grasp of your mental faculties.
Exactly, and hence the discussion of the geometry in the story. That is just not something that you or I or any of us humans with our limited brain capacities can understand or comprehend. It's not within our framework that we have.
Yeah, and that's where the metaphor, I think, gets its power. It's precisely by being unreasonable.
But it's also how like the truth of something is watered down when we put it into words or ideas or speak it. I was going to read this thing in Frankenstein last week, but I couldn't find it. It There's an essay by Paul Cantor on it, and he says, when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline, and the most glorious poetry that has ever been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conceptions of the poet.
That's great.
I love that.
And it just reminds me of, when we think about meditation and chanting and the weird words that we get in the story Cthulhu, it kind of points to this, inner truth that gets bastardized when we try to put, words to our thoughts.
Yeah, it's a filter. It mediates that, and then you end up with this placeholder for the experience. But in the exchange of all those, semiotic placeholders, you forget that they're stand-ins. You start treating the words and the signs and symbols as the thing itself.
Right.
Yeah. Always a bad idea. But hard not to do, correct?
It's impossible not to do.
Yeah.
Well, that's all we have.
I don't think it is all we have. I think it's all we
Really?
use.
Well, it's a great source of our power anyway, which we're kind of in love with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, true.
I mean, that's what we use. The scientists that are out there trying to categorize and map out and sort of, explain Cthulhu and, turn that into, one more piece of human knowledge in the catalog, they're going to translate, they're the translators who are going to put that into the system of placeholders so it can be moved around. It can be manipulated and understood. And then, that's where we get, all of our power over manipulating nature is in that way of map making, isn't it?
Yeah, in the naming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ordering, defining.
Yeah.
It's like it didn't start that way. It's interesting, the artisans and the craftsmen, there was, I guess it's related to working memory in some ways. There was only so far you could go with your hands, and you can get pretty complicated, and then you got to have some blueprints or a computer or something like that. Once your working memory hits its limits, you need to start working with symbols that have their own sort of memory.
Yeah, you need to be able to piggyback, pile up, compress.
Yeah. And my working memory is a short bus. I'm pretty sure.
You and me both.
Well, yeah. Thank God for Google.
Well, I'd like to just add that, we've probably seen imagery of this in a lot of science fiction. Off the top of my head, I think about a lot of the stuff that Guillermo del Toro does with a lot of his figures. The Independence Day creatures, those tentacle-faced things, Alien.
Right.
I think a lot of this comes from it's an unknown kind of a horror. It has just enough of a figure to be relatively threatening. It's bigger than you usually, or it has power. But you have a hard time looking at it, know what you're taking in. And I think that's, one of the strengths of this. It's not just, horror from a character level, like worried about what's going to happen to that character, but it's just a pervasive from everywhere kind of a haunt. Even the book Leaves of Grass, it's really, in that horror story, the measurements inside the house are longer than the measurement outside the house. So the house is bigger on the inside than the outside, and it's just
like the TARDIS.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like the TARDIS.
I don't know. Yeah, I think that's Dr. Who.
Yeah.
So there's just this has been the basic notions of the good guts of this story. I think have been pulled out time and time again to inspire art, and I just think that's worth mentioning. Whereas something like Frankenstein, you get the reverse of that. It's almost no detail, and it's oddly descriptive how much tentacle, gooey, pulpy imagery you get in Lovecraft stuff.
Well, it's also interesting that he was committed to the short story. I think he only wrote one novel, and he wrote 100 short stories. He was primarily a short story writer, and it's fascinating. And also, I've learned that had he not ever written anything after the Call of Cthulhu, he would still have been as famous because of this story. And he wrote some really major things after this, obviously. I mean, also there's movies. I've actually seen the Call of Cthulhu movie made by the guys who run the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society.
There's a video game too.
Yeah, there's a video game too, and it's black and white, and it doesn't. There's no sound, and the reason is because I've been told that the guys do these movies of Lovecraft's work, but they utilize the technology that would have been available at that time. So they did a movie of Call of Cthulhu, and so there was no audio because I guess there was no audio available for a black and white movie. That's what I was told. And
I'm just thinking about, war reenactors, Civil War reenactors and
that
bone buttons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
People can really get into this stuff.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing.
Jeez.
And also absolutely. And he and then they made a movie about the Mountains of Madness, and apparently that does have sound, but I don't know if it's in color. So like you're saying about these war reenactors, it's like that. They reflect what they do reflects what they believe was happening at that time.
Nice.
Weird.
Anybody want to throw out their favorite lines?
Let me double check.
I mean, unless there's something huge that we haven't. Did you burn yours already? Yeah,
I did.
I actually
mine was what Laura already mentioned at the beginning of that first paragraph. So.
Well, no one said this one yet. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other.
That's funny. I was going to ask if Laura could pronounce some of those chants.
I have not had enough to drink yet.
I was going to say you haven't been.
I need
practicing.
No, absolutely not. And also, not only can the name Cthulhu not be properly pronounced by any human being, right? But I think I did say at some point that I was told that if you're, above the age of 30 or whatever, you can't understand this story at all. But I did have a line, which was part of this first paragraph, I think. We live in a place. I think I really like that one. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there you have the fall of Eden, correct?
Right.
Once again.
Absolutely. We fucked
knowledge,
up.
Well, knowledge is, if you actually want to bring yourself, if you go after knowledge, then you're going to bring yourself too close to the gods, and that's the greatest sin.
That is.
Trying to be a god.
I have one. I think most of my lines were already said, but I like this one. The aperture was black, with a darkness almost material. That tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its eon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping membranous wings.
Ooh. That was a good one.
I've got one. This is from the end here. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think.
Nice.
I wanted to say that line, what has risen, what is it? What has risen once will rise again. What is it, Nathan?
What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise.
Yeah, I like that. I want to put, that's my second favorite line. Or it's close to my first. I like that one.
Are we gonna find? Is that going to be at the bottom of your emails now?
Yeah.